Whether you're a content creator yourself or maybe you support content creators that you enjoy, I think this video is going to be really important to watch because I've been spending the past few weeks digging into a lot of how Patreon operates, and it's been a platform that I've been using over the past few years. But after digging up all the facts, there's a few changes that I want to make, and if you're a content creator, I think that these are changes that you'll probably want to make as well. Or if you support a content creator, I think this is information that you'll want to share with any of those creators that you follow, so that the money that you're donating goes to them and not to some giant corporation. And I'm not going to make this into a long drawn out video, but I will go into a little bit of the details and back up some of my claims here. But I'm just going to tell you right now what it is that I found and why I think that if you are on Patreon, whether you're a creator or a supporter, you should be trying to get off of it onto an alternative as quickly as possible. A lot of us creators just chose Patreon because it seems like the de facto standard in the space, and it's pretty much what every other content creator is using. And if you check out their website, they do make it pretty inviting, telling you that starting your Patreon is free. But if you are going to be setting up those tiers that you pretty much need in order to get any sort of subscription revenue that we're all familiar with, that's going to be costing you an 8% or 12% commission, depending on the features that you need. And although I do personally feel that 8% is a pretty steep commission to ask for, especially when you consider that these are donations and they're taking that commission off of the goodwill of others, I still do understand that Patreon does need to make a profit, and they are providing a service and a safe place for those supporters to make those donations. But what you may not have noticed is this tiny text here that almost blends in with the background that basically says that you're going to be paying a ton more money than that 8%. And if you click on that, it does bring you to the more granular details on how their platform fees actually work. But I'm not going to bore you by going through all these paragraphs and numbers on this giant page, because I already went through it all and I already ran all the numbers, and I can tell you that the true cost of Patreon is actually about 20% of the total donations that are processed. And I didn't even run the numbers for the 12% premium plan. This 20% is what you can expect to pay if you are on the pro plan, which is marketed as 8%. Something else that I want to point out is that Patreon did used to have a founders tier that only charged 5% of the income that you earned on Patreon, which to me is a much more reasonable number. But this was also discontinued back in 2019, and Patreon, although they are a privately owned company, they do have shares and shareholders, and it is in the CEO's best interest to increase their profits each and every year, year over year, in order to show that they are doing their job. And Patreon has raised hundreds of millions of dollars of fundraising, with their most recent fundraiser being only back in 2021. Patreon has 37 different investors, and the goal of these investors is all the same. They all want to multiply their investment with that ideal number that all these investors are chasing to be that magical 10x. With this most recent round of financing, this put Patreon's valuation into the range of multiple billions of dollars. But the big problem here is that Patreon has very nearly saturated the market, with the number of active Patreon creators just not really increasing that much over the past few years. And how are these investors supposed to get multiple times back their investment when that investment was so massive and you're just not seeing the growth that Patreon needs to back that up? Well, one of the easiest ways to do that is to just squeeze your existing creators for as much as possible. And companies these days are just getting more and more clever at doing that. And there's an amazing video that goes into all the details of this in regards to Patreon, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below if you do want to learn more about this. So basically what I'm saying is that tier does not exist anymore, and I wouldn't be surprised if these numbers slowly creep up over the years, charging even a more ridiculous amount than they already are. And as a content creator, this does make me pretty angry for a few reasons. First off, it's really hard being a content creator. Most of us out there are not even making minimum wage. Not to brag here, but I think I have a pretty awesome community and my content does quite well. And also I do have over 100 members on my Patreon myself, and I am still not even close to minimum wage. And yes, that is considering all my income sources when it comes to content creation, But I'm not making this video to guilt you into listening to me, and us content creators are doing this because we do enjoy the content that we create. And for a lot of us, this is just one of our many outlets to enjoy different hobbies that we love. But ideally, out of respect for myself, I do want this to become a sustainable source of income at some point or another, and I am working towards that. And I know that it does take time, but every single penny on the way there really does count. And it's one thing for Patreon to burn me along the way, but these Patreon subscribers are some of the best people that the world has to offer, donating some of their own hard-earned cash towards someone else to try and make their efforts just a little bit more sustainable. And I know if I was someone who donated, let's say, $100 towards some cause that is important to me, I would be really pissed off if I found out that $20 of that $100 went into some other person's pocket that has nothing to do with the cause that I'm trying to support. And unfortunately, that's exactly what's going on here with Patreon, and as a supporter, as much of your support should go where you intend it to. And I know I am saying that as someone who would directly benefit from that, but I'm also someone who's been doing content creation and decided to continue doing content creation for years now, knowingly making less than minimum wage. And if my implications weren't clear there, I'm basically saying that if this was all about the money, I'd probably be doing something else. I'll dig into more of the numbers and some of the details in just a second here, but if that's all the information you wanted, I think the main takeaways here are that if you are a content creator and you aren't using Patreon, then you should probably look somewhere else, and I do have some recommendations at the end of this video. Or if you already are using Patreon, I think it's worth switching to one of those other options out of respect for yourself as well as for your supporters, and just explaining to them what I just explained in this video. Or you could even just go ahead and share this video with them if you think I did a decent job. But if you are a supporter and you want your money to go towards the person or cause that you're supporting, I think you should also urge them to switch away from Patreon, because a lot of creators don't realize that 20% of your donations are being taken away from them because Patreon doesn't make it very obvious. Like I said, a lot of us just use it because it is the de facto standard in the space, and a lot of us just assume that we're being charged that more reasonable 8%, not realizing how much more Patreon is actually taking, especially in the long run. Thanks so much for watching up to this point, and I hope this content has been useful, but for those of us who want to dig more into the details and the numbers, let's start by jumping into my own Patreon. And I have about 100 paid members plus a few extra because I do post some content on here periodically, but I don't put it behind a paywall because my Patreon is here simply for anyone that wants to help support my efforts. And if you do want to see the content that I post there, you can just join for free and that will get you access to that. But if you do want to support me, then there's that option for you as well. But what this all amounts to is about $432 per month. Or at least that's what Patreon says. And this is all public information. I believe if you go to my page, you can see these numbers. But if you jump into the insights here, you'll see pretty much the same thing. 94 members and 432 monthly earnings. But then if you click on the actual earnings tab, you basically still see the same thing, $420 for this month. But I first noticed the discrepancy when I actually exported the data and saw all of the details in the Excel spreadsheet. But later I did notice that they have this table below this chart, which does show most of those details as well. And you can see here that for the month of November, an amount of $516 was charged, with only about $419 actually being given to the creator. So that's about $100 US that Patreon's taking from these donations each and every month from a pool of only $500. Don't get me wrong, I'm super appreciative that that pool is at $500, but $100 is 20% of that, and that's just insane. And this is just for me, who's a pretty small content creator, so you can just imagine how this scales up the more popular that someone's Patreon is. And like I said, I did go through this entire page and I crunched all the numbers, and I also compared them against what I was being charged to just make sure that everything adds up. And I put together this simple little spreadsheet here. And I know there's a lot on the screen here, so let's just take a look at this first table. And what I'm showing here is on the left-hand side, we have a bunch of different pledge levels. And then on the right hand side, we have all the different fees. And when it comes to Patreon, there's pretty much two different formulas for calculating the fees for a given pledge amount. And that pretty much is determined by whether that pledge is $3 or less or over $3. And those two formulas are right here. So I'm applying those appropriately. And then in this column, I just amalgamate all of that into a percentage of that original pledge amount, just to give us a more clear idea of what we're being charged. And you can see from this table that that ranges anywhere from 14 to 23%. But the reason that I have two tables here is because there is actually two different ways that Patreon calculates all of this, depending on a bunch of different factors. And they have that all outlined in these tables here. And the way that I'm presenting all of that in the spreadsheet here is that this top table is the best case scenario. If everything is on the lowest amount of fees as possible, this is what you can expect. And then this bottom table is the worst case scenario. So if everything is as bad as possible, then this is the fees that you can expect for that scenario. This also doesn't account for any conversion fees, because if anyone is paying Patreon with anything other than USD, they're also going to charge a 2.5% premium on that. The reason I'm not including that is because that's pretty much static across any platform that you use. So if you are switching somewhere else, you're probably still going to get dinged with a 2.5% conversion fee. But what does all of this actually mean and amount to for every single month that supporters are being charged on Patreon? Well, that's what I have these tables on the right for. So these are just sample scenarios using these numbers here, and I just put in 20 of each type of pledge. If anything, you'll probably have more people in the lower pledges, which actually makes all of these calculations worse for you, since Patreon does charge more for those lower tiers. But for simplicity, I just have an equal distribution, and we can see here that that amounts to about $500 each and every month in this hypothetical situation, which also happens to be very close to what my Patreon makes. So for a small creator like myself with about $500 worth of donations from their supporters, $83 of that each and every month is going somewhere else. And I think you can start to see how this really starts to add up, especially when you consider it over the year, which pretty much means that you're paying $1,000 in fees for a small creator, and that is for the best case scenario on Patreon. If we look at the worst case scenario, that's closer to $1,200, but you can imagine reality is probably going to be somewhere in between. And I should mention that this $83 also does include the $2 payout fee that they mention on that creator's fees page. But when I actually went and looked at the actual fee that I was actually charged about $4.50. So I'm not sure exactly how that payout fee works. And I don't know if that scales to even a higher number if you are receiving more donations. And one thing that you might notice if you do start exporting your data and start comparing and adding things in different ways is that a lot of things don't actually add up when it comes to Patreon. So I'm just doing the best I can with the information that's provided to me. So I hope I've explained these issues well enough, but now how do we solve those issues, and what are the other options, and how do they actually compare to Patreon? And I did a little searching around and looked into a few other options, and I found two other ones that have a very strong following, have been around for a long time, and are just as trustworthy as Patreon, but have much better business practices and much better fees as well. And those two different options are known as Ko-fi as well as Buy Me a Coffee. And you've probably seen these before on various websites where different creators are using these ones rather than Patreon. Maybe they came to the same conclusion I did, I'm not sure. I haven't seen a whole lot of other content creators go into the fine details of Patreon as I just did, so I'm not sure that too many of us actually know the actual amount we're being charged. The fees for these two are about the same, but of the two, I think the one that I prefer is Ko-fi. Not only does it have a way cuter icon, but they also have a flat fee tier, which is just $6 to $8 monthly. And this is a much better number than that $80 to $100 that we're seeing on Patreon. The nice thing about this is that they do also offer a 5% tier, so if you're making under a certain amount and that $8 is eating up more than 5%, then you can just choose that 5% contributor tier. One thing I didn't mention about Patreon is that if you use it, you probably realize that it is very, very buggy. There's a lot of issues when I was setting up the tiers, as well as when I just message people. For years now, whenever I message people, I have to copy what I say before I hit send, because sometimes when I send that message, it just clears it and then sends it into the abyss, never to be found again, which is really, really frustrating. And I've just gotten into the habit of copying anything before I send a message to anyone on Patreon. I haven't fully switched over to Ko-fi yet, but I have set it up and been playing around with it just to make sure there's no hidden surprises here either. And so far, the fees that it's been charging are in line with exactly what it's saying here. And also the UI is way nicer and I haven't seen any bugs whatsoever. And they also support single donations for people that just want to donate to you once and don't want to join on to any special tier. And they take a 0% commission for that, which is just amazing. And they never hold your money. It just goes directly into your PayPal or your Stripe account. And they also charge supporters month by month based on the day that that supporter joined. So if a supporter joins on the 30th of a month, they're not going to get charged for that current month and then the next month the following day. Instead, this makes a lot more sense and they're paying for the time that they've been there rather than how Patreon works where they double charge you if you joined right at the end of the month, which I'm sure they're aware of, but they didn't fix because it generates more revenue for them. Buy Me a Coffee looks like it supports a lot of the same features and also charges about the same amount as Ko-fi, but I don't think it has that flat rate tier. And I also read in a few places that they don't integrate with PayPal, which is what I use, so I didn't look into this one as much as I have with Ko-fi. But these both look like great options to look into if you're looking to switch, and one might be a little bit more appropriate for you depending on your preferences and how you have things set up. One thing to note with Ko-fi and Buy Me a Coffee is that even though they don't charge as many fees, PayPal still will. So when you do get those instant transfers into PayPal, when someone either donates to you or adds themselves to one of your tiers, then there will be a fee charged by them. So there still are a few fees here that might show up as a bit of surprise, but they don't show up on Ko-fi's end. Instead, they're going to be showing up on either PayPal or Stripe, depending on what you use. And this is all mentioned in Ko-fi's documentation, which was a lot simpler to follow than Patreon's. And those fees are pretty much going to be 3% plus 30 cents, in addition to the $6 monthly fee that Ko-fi charges. But I threw all those in the spreadsheet as well, so we can do a proper comparison here. And you can see that the total fees are about half of what you might see from Patreon. I'm not sure if there's a way to get these fees down even further, but if you do have any suggestions or realizations, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I'll leave a link to both of these in the description below. These aren't affiliate links. I don't get any commission or any bonuses from sending you there. I just want you to have the best information as possible, and I'll also leave a link to my spreadsheet as well if you want to pull it down, maybe mess with some of the numbers and try to plug in your tiers and see exactly what Patreon is charging you. I know how difficult it is to be a content creator, and I also massively appreciate anyone out there who's been putting their skin in the game and helping support any of the content creators out there that they enjoy. And I hope this video has helped you to try and keep more of that money within that realm and within that relationship rather than some big corporations. And I don't have any issue with companies making money for the value that they provide, but I just think in this case, Patreon is being a little bit sleazy with the way that they provide their information, and they're also charging way more than I think is reasonable, quite a bit more, and anything we can do to correct that will make a massive difference for the content creators out there, as well as the supporters that are supporting them. And that's pretty much everything I wanted to cover. I hope I explained all of this well enough. It is always a bit difficult jumping into these conversations, especially when they involve money, and especially when I am a content creator myself. But I hope my points make sense, and if you do have any questions or concerns, feel free to ask me down below, and I'll do my best to give a helpful answer. But other than that, thanks so much for watching, and until next time, have a good one.